So, just like last week, we're doing something a little special for the month of December, and we're spending these last few episodes of the year recapping what's been happening in the true crime world in 2024. Last episode, we talked about cases like Diddy's house being raided and an NBA player being charged with murder. So, if you want to hear more about those, definitely check out the last episode. And why are we doing this? It's because we often get questions and requests like, oh, can y'all cover this big case? Or what do you think about that case? And we really don't cover the big cases that you see in the news because one, we like to cover cases that are lesser known and haven't received as much attention. And two, we like to wait until the trials have finished up so that we have all the facts and we don't have to say allegedly to everything. But at the same time, we're a podcast of the people, and we know y'all want to hear our thoughts about all the messed up stuff that's happened this year. So we're going to kick off this episode talking about cases and stories that happened between May and August of 2024. Welcome back to your True Crime Wrap. Hi, I'm Cam.
And I'm Dev.
And you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up. So before we get into all of the crazy messed up stuff that happened between May and August of 2024, what you drinking?
So girly, I have a little fun drink today. I am actually drinking the same foaming latte that I talked about a few episodes back, but I made it boozy today and I put a shot of vodka in it, and that is what I am drinking today. And the best part about it is you cannot taste the vodka that's in here. So if you like a foamy espresso, put you some vodka in it. Nobody's gonna notice. What you drinking, friend?
So friend, today I am drinking a red wine that my mom got me from Williams-Sonoma called Etna Rosso. It is made from Nerello mescalese grapes, which apparently grow on the side of an active volcano in Sicily.
Big purr.
Yeah, big purr. That's what I'm drinking today.
So like we said, it is now time to get into all of the foolishness that was 2024. And I'm going to kick us off with our first story that happened in May of 2024. So on May 6th, 2024, 26-year-old Bernard Jr. Polite walked into the Jesus Dwelling Place Church about 10 miles east of downtown Pittsburgh, just after 1 p.m. Upon entering the church, he walked down the aisle and pointed a firearm at the pastor who was delivering a sermon and pulled the trigger. This terrifying encounter was captured during a live stream of Pastor Glenn Jeremy's Sunday sermon. As Bernard pulled the trigger, Pastor Glenn ran behind the podium for safety, and thankfully, the firearm failed to discharge. And as Bernard attempted to enter the pulpit, he was tackled by a deacon named Clarence McAllister, who ran out of the pews and grabbed Bernard, wrestling him to the ground, and after some fighting, Pastor Glenn came from behind the podium and pried the gun out of Bernard's hands and assisted in holding him on the ground. Another member of the church had called the police, and Pastor Glenn and Clarence held Bernard down until authorities arrived. Pastor Glenn later gave an interview with WPXI of Pittsburgh, stating, quote, "He stood up and he smiled at me, and it was just a smile. But he comes to right here, and then all of a sudden, that's when I see him pull a gun, and all I could do was just duck out of the way," end quote. He continued by saying, quote, "It clicked. You heard him shoot it. So God jammed the gun so that bullet didn't come out," end quote. Pastor Glenn further stated that he spoke with Bernard after the attempted shooting and stated Bernard said, quote, "Look, spirits was in my mind. They got in my mind and they told me to come in and shoot the pastor," end quote. Pastor Glenn continued by stating, quote, "He actually apologized to me. I told him that I forgive him and I want you to know that I love you, end quote. Which, Pastor Glenn, a better man than me. Bernard was charged with criminal attempted homicide, aggravated assault, and reckless endangering another person, and was being held without bail at Allegheny County Jail. However, though this should be the end of our story, hours later, police made a grisly discovery at Bernard's house. At 8:45 p.m., the Allegheny County Police Department responded to a house and found an adult male identified as Derek Polite, who was 56 years old, deceased. After an autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Derek Polite's cause of death was a single gunshot, leading to a homicide investigation. During this investigation, police discovered that Bernard was Derek's cousin, and the pair had been living together for several years. After family members saw reports of the church shooting, they went to the pair's residence, quote, to check on Derek's well-being, end quote. It was during this check-in that family members found Derek deceased and called the police. Police believe Bernard shot his cousin, then went to the church with the same gun, as it would later be determined that the bullets from the gun recovered by the police at the church matched the bullets recovered from Derek's body. Bernard was then charged with 1 count of criminal homicide in addition to his previous charges. The motive for both crimes remains unclear, as police said there was no signs of an altercation in the home they shared, and it appeared that the victim was shot as he was walking up the steps from the first floor to the second floor. Police also confirmed that Bernard did not appear to have a relationship with Jesus Dwellings Place Church or Pastor Glenn.
I remember seeing this story on the news and then seeing that he had also killed one of his family members right before this, and just knowing that this was likely caused by some sort of mental break, because there's no other justification for something like that aside from pure evil. But based on what he said to the pastor, it really does seem like he was going through something mentally, and that's what led him to commit such terrible things.
Absolutely. I definitely think there is some mental health issues taking place there, but I also gotta agree with Pastor Glenn. I don't honestly find myself to be a particularly religious person, but to me, the only logical explanation is that there was divine intervention, that this man did not get shot on live stream in front of his congregation.
Right. I totally agree. Total divine intervention. And also, he probably is already going to hell for killing someone, but to kill a pastor in the house of God, yeah, I think there's a whole nother tier of hell for that.
Come on now. Yeah, it's one of those outer circles that nobody likes to talk about.
But I do hope that he can get the mental health support that he needs in jail, because clearly he is going through something. I hope also that the pastor, the congregation that witnessed this, and Derek Polite's loved ones can also get the mental health support that they need, because they also went through something terrible witnessing and being affected by this.
Absolutely. That's super important. And family members did comment that Bernard has struggled with his mental health for a very long time, but they were still completely shocked and surprised that it culminated in this. So absolutely wishing them healing, wishing them the best, wishing them lots of therapy to work through what they have been through. So on to our next story, which took place on May 19th, 2024, when an attempted coup took place in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This coup was orchestrated by Christian Malanga, a Congolese native who lived in the United States as a political asylee. He founded a U.S. registered party, the United Congolese Party, in 2010 and referred to himself as the, quote, president, end quote, and head of the new Zaire government in exile, which he proclaimed in Belgium in 2017. The coup targeted President Felix Tshisekedi and his economy minister, Vital Kamerhe, and attempted to assassinate both men. The assailants attacked both the National Palace and Vital's residence. The men who staged the coup were heavily armed and put up an intense fight at Vital's home. The coup attempt was foiled quickly by the security forces, and Christian was killed during the attempt, as well as 5 other people who lost their lives during the coup attempt, including a security guard posted to Vital's house and a man whom the group stopped at random on the road in order to steal his Jeep. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, security forces caught 3 Americans along with dozens of others on the banks of the nearby Congo River, trying to flee the presidential complex. Christian's son, 22-year-old Marcel Malanga, was among those caught, as was his close friend from Utah, 21-year-old Tyler Thompson, and another American, 36-year-old Maryland native Benjamin Zalman Paloun. In the end, Congolese security forces rounded up dozens of people in the aftermath of the attempted coup, placing a total of 51 people under arrest on charges of murder, terrorism, criminal association, amongst others. The coup trial in Kinshasa's Ndolo military prison began in June, after several weeks in which the defendants were held incommunicado. When called before the bar, many defendants testified to having been tortured by military intelligence agents while in detention. The case was also riddled with translation issues, as the first Army-provided interpreter was barely able to understand English. The accused U.S. citizens were unable to speak either Congo's official language of government, French, or Lingala. However, throughout the trial, the 3 American defendants mostly stuck to the same story, that Christian Mangala forced them to take part in the coup at gunpoint, and that they had feared for their lives. Most of the remaining Congolese nationalists offered a similar story, mainly recruited from Western Congo. The majority said that Christian had hired them to work for his NGO, mentioning nothing about his political aims. After 3 months of hearings into the events of May 19th, in September of 2024, a military tribunal in the Democratic Republic of Congo found 37 members of the alleged attacking group, including the 3 U.S. citizens, 1 Canadian, and a British national, guilty on all counts. The other 14 people, mostly those rounded up mistakenly after the coup, were acquitted. The tribunal then handed down death sentences to all 37 people for their role in the failed coup.
Yeah, this was a story when I saw that the coup had happened and that 3 Americans were involved. I was like, what is going on? And then I saw that one of the 3 Americans was the son of the person who led the coup. I was like, I just knew that it was going to be some craziness. And I do remember reading also that Marcel's mom was saying that Christian had not really been involved in his son's life for many years, and that he'd recently come back in, and maybe Marcel saw this as an opportunity to build back up his relationship with his father.
Mm-hmm.
And if what everyone is saying is true, that they joined Christian thinking they were joining his NGO and not thinking they were participating in a coup, that is really messed up that he got them involved in this. I do think on the side of the Americans, especially the ones who were not directly related to Christian, it is a little tougher because there are many countries in Africa where they say, you know, don't travel to this country because it is not safe and we cannot guarantee that we can protect you as an American citizen. And I feel like oftentimes you see Americans going to countries in Africa thinking that it's going to be a fun trip, whatever, and not really taking the security concerns seriously.
Absolutely. But also, just to defend his friends, really, that went with him, they were told that this was going to be a fun vacation. They were told that they were just going to hang out. And I have a lot of sympathy for that because I have a lot of friends who are Nigerian, right? And they have always told me, don't ever go to Nigeria without somebody who is Nigerian. Right. And not to say that Nigeria is a dangerous country by any means, but if somebody who at least has a connection to that country is inviting me to that country, then I would feel more inclined to go under the guise that that person would take care of me, you know? And that's what I also think is very unfortunate about this. And I actually knew nothing about this case before I looked into it. Me and Cam did a decent amount of collaboration for last episode and the episodes to come. And so she's the one who actually put this on my radar. And I was fascinated, not only about the coup itself, but also the allegations of abuse in prison, the fact that death penalty was brought back basically a few years ago in relation to this case, in relation to tyranny in general. It was fascinating to read the history behind it.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll mention too about them being told they were coming for a vacation, I'm pretty sure they were also offered money. And there was someone else who played football with Marcel who was offered this trip and he declined it. I believe it was actually his girlfriend who pushed him to decline it because she was like, no, you're not going to be leaving 4 months just for some money. And he could have been there too, facing the death penalty. It also is messed up that during the trial, they didn't have someone who could properly advocate for them due to the language barrier. And I can only imagine how scary that must have been, being in a country where you're not familiar with either language that people speak and knowing that you're facing such huge charges. And it is disappointing that the man who orchestrated all of this isn't alive to speak for himself.
Absolutely. And that's always how it goes. The people who really change somebody else's life forever see no real consequences. Because yeah, he's dead. But in my opinion, he had to have some understanding that that was going to happen anyway. Because I think the thing that's the most interesting about this coup for me is it doesn't seem like there was actually a plan to take over. It just seemed like you guys wanted to storm in this house and kill the president and kill his basically right-hand man. But like, then what?
Right. And if what the defendants say is true, it seems like his plan was, once he got the people he needed, to coerce them into doing his bidding and then basically take it by force. But maybe he knew it was a fool's mission. Maybe he underestimated the counterforce from the president. But yeah, I think he had his own political ambitions and political plans, but it didn't seem like he tactically thought out what would happen if he were to kill the president and the economy minister.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very odd case. Very sad case. I'm not anti-death penalty, but I'm more in favor of it in the States. You know, other countries have death by firing squad and a bunch of other things that it's so scary to think about.
Yeah. And I am anti-death penalty for cases like this, because even though we like to think the U.S. justice system is, foolproof better, I think relatively it is better than some others, but we still have many flaws. And it's cases like this that harden my stance against the death penalty.
Completely understandable. And on to our final story for May. We're going to finish it up with something that's a little bit more lighthearted. As on May 23rd, 2024, 34-year-old rapper, best known for his 2007 hit Beautiful Girls, Sean Kingston, was arrested in California on multiple charges of fraud and theft after a SWAT team raided his South Florida mansion. Janice Turner, Sean's 61-year-old mother, was also arrested during the raid in connection to the fraud and theft charges. They said, keep it in the family.
Please leave.
Nope, you're stuck with me. This is indeed a hostage situation.
I'm dead.
Allegedly, the raid is connected to a lawsuit filed against Sean Kingston in February, accusing Sean of defrauding a Florida company that installed in his home a 232-inch television that he never paid for. Yes, you heard me correctly. 232 inches. That is over 19 feet or 5.9 meters for our international listeners. So, Sean Kingston and his mother, Janice Turner, are facing numerous charges, including conducting an organized scheme to defraud, grand theft, and identity theft. Arrest warrants allege they committed over $1 million in fraud from October 2023 to March 2024. Run rampant in 6 months. Love that for you. And this includes stealing nearly $500,000 in jewelry, over $200,000 in funds from Bank of America, $160,000 from a car dealer for a Cadillac Escalade, $100,000 from First Republic Bank, and $86,000 for a custom-made bed.
Now they know they didn't need the bed.
Look, is Sean a big man? I done forgot. Is Sean a big man? Is she like Shaq big? Because you know Shaq need custom stuff like that.
He not that big. Not $86,000 big.
You right.
Actually, let me look up his height.
I swear to God, if you say he's 6'8", if that man's not at least 6'8", I'm going to clown him so hard.
Girl, according to IMDb, that man is 6'2". He could get a king, not even a California king.
Stop it right now.
$86,000. And you know you don't got money. Now you're just being greedy.
Absolutely, because $86,000 is Shaq level customization. Additionally, Sean Kingston is accused of defrauding Valerie Entertainment, a Florida company, out of $120,000 for installing said 232-inch television in his home. The lawsuit claims that Kingston promised to collaborate with Justin Bieber on commercials for the company, which he never did. And the lawsuit alleges that he never even contacted Justin Bieber about these commercials and failed to make further payments after an initial $30,000 deposit.
232-inch TV? I feel like I couldn't even watch anything because I got to stand 30 feet away just to see what's going on. Maybe I'm just broke.
You know what? I will absolutely say I'm broke because he's paying more for beds and TVs than I've made to date. And honestly, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm really, really not. But I didn't know like Sean was still out here like allegedly making money. I thought his time had come and gone. Sorry, and personally, I never even liked beautiful girls. Sorry. I didn't even know he had like the celebrity power to finesse these brands like he's finessing them.
I think that even when you're like a one-hit wonder, two-hit wonder, you could still kind of play off of that. You'll find a brand that will allow it.
You're right. So, attorney Dennis Card, who is representing Valerie Entertainment, described Kingston as, quote, a systematic scammer, end quote, citing a history of unpaid debts for luxury goods, including over $1 million in judgments against him for watches and jewelry. Hold on, friend, because I know we've been on Sean's neck a little bit, but now it's time to talk about mama. Because Janice Turner, who is being held on a $160,000 bond at Broward County Jail, is also implicated in her son's alleged crimes, as she has a history of financial crimes herself. As Janet pled guilty in January of 2006 to 4 counts of filing false loan applications and 1 count of bank fraud involving $132,000 in stolen funds that she was ordered to repay. She was sentenced to 16 months in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release.
Well, the apple don't fall far from the tree. I can say that.
Absolutely. In a lot of ways, I think it might still be attached.
The apple's still growing.
So honestly, it looks like things are finally catching up to Sean Kingston, as he has a well-documented history of financial disputes and legal troubles. Apparently, between 2015 and 2022, he was sued multiple times for failing to pay for high-end watches, jewelry, and other luxury items. In one case, he was ordered to pay $356,000 to a company for unpaid customized watches. Oh, you're going to love this, friend. Hold on, because you're going to love this part, because this is my favorite part. After news of the raid, Sean posted on Instagram, asserting, quote, "People love negative energy. I am good, and so is my mother. My lawyers are handling everything as we speak," end quote.
Is he paying the lawyers, though?
I'm sure he's going to promise them a commercial as well. Maybe he'll get Usher to be in that one instead of Justin Bieber.
Yeah, diversify the lie.
Of course, of course.
Oh my gosh. He hasn't been convicted yet. So I think that these alleged crimes are simply greed, because you do have stars that fall off and they are not making the same money that they used to make. They can't afford the luxury things that they used to make. And you have stars that adjust to that. I think that it's really sad when you see people making fun of former stars who are working at grocery stores or at restaurants, because life is expensive. It's expensive. Like, you can't just try and maintain that type of lifestyle if you're not making that type of money. And kudos to them for still making money the way that they can. But when you run into these issues like Sean has allegedly run into, where maybe you're not making the same amount of money, but you're trying to maintain that same lifestyle, that's when you start getting into crime. And I'd rather work at a restaurant, work at the grocery store than be in prison. But some other people wouldn't.
Absolutely. There's a level of humility there that clearly Sean doesn't have. I feel like the only people who feel like working a traditional job is beneath them are the people who just think too highly of themselves. Are people who think, oh, I'm a big star, I shouldn't have to work because I was in that Gerber commercial when I was 6 months old and I'm a star. Like, I'm sorry, sweetie, you're 47 now. You got to let it go. You need to get a real job.
But yeah, like some of these purchases, like a 232-inch TV, you don't need that. $86,000 bed, you don't need that. It was just greed. Like, it's just pure greed, trying to maintain that lifestyle of luxury where a lot of things are unnecessary.
Absolutely. And it's a level of entitlement. I feel like there's a level of like, I'm entitled to these nice things because I had a hit song a decade and a half ago. It doesn't make any sense to me. And again, we have to say these crimes are alleged because nobody's convicted of anything. But I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. One thing for certain and two things for sure is that the feds are going to get it right. If the feds are knocking on your door, you already did it. Like, I hate to be that person, but I genuinely feel that way. Because when the system works correctly, you should have a high conviction rate. You should have overwhelming amounts of evidence. That's how the system is supposed to work. I've been asked that a lot of like, oh, everybody who goes to trial is convicted and blah, 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 you know, as a criticism. I'm like, but that's how it's supposed to be. When you investigate well, when you have a good case, you should take somebody who is overwhelmingly guilty. You shouldn't try somebody if there are things in their favor. You shouldn't do that, like ethically. So again, the feds win, 96% of their cases. I don't know what the actual number is. I'll put it right here in the YouTube video. So I'm just personally a firm believer that if the feds have knocked on your door, go ahead and hang it up because they already know. You did it. You're done for. You're going to prison. Sorry.
Right. And who does Devin fear the most?
Leave it in the comments below.
If you know, you know. If you don't, go back and listen to our episodes and see if you can figure out the answer.
Devin's number one fear. I will personally cash app the first person to comment what Devin fears most in this world. I will personally cash app you $10.
Don't say anything if I start a secret account.
Kim, I could just give you $10, girl. I love you. And that completes all of our cases for May, friend.
Ooh, y'all, May was a doozy. But I hope y'all still strapped in because now we're on the way to June when Rex Heuermann, the accused Gilgo Beach killer, was charged in 2 more murders. This took place on June 6, 2024 in Suffolk County, New York. So like I said, Rex Heuermann, the accused Gilgo Beach killer, was charged with the 2003 murder of Jessica Taylor and the 1993 murder of Sandra Costilla. These new charges brought the total charges against the architect and married father of 2 to 6 murders. And I first learned about this case actually through Crime Junkie before Rex Heuermann was even charged. But for those who are unfamiliar, prior to Rex Heuermann's arrest in July 2023, the Gilgo Beach killer was infamous in New York and was tied to at least 8 deaths ranging from 1993 to 2010. The other victims that Rex Heuermann has been charged with are Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Melissa Barthelemy, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes, all of whose remains were found in 2010 along the ocean on Gilgo Beach. Now, when police investigated Rex Heuermann, they found a file on his computer that basically detailed what he did to prepare for the murders and what he did after to cover his tracks. And this file included things like making sure he got enough sleep and making sure he had a good alibi. Rex Heuermann is also a lead suspect in the 2000 disappearance of Valerie Mack. He has pleaded not guilty to all the charges and had his last court appearance, which was just a status hearing, on October 16th, 2024. His next court date is set for December 17th, Side note, we are filming this on December 15th. So his next court date is set for 2 days from now, during which the judge aims to set the trial date. And yeah, Dev, I don't know how familiar you are with this case, but it is wild. There is a lot of evidence against him. So the fact that he's pleading not guilty is not surprising. I feel like with a lot of serial killers, you see this, but it's like, really, that's what you want to do? You got it.
Yeah, but girl, you know the thing that serial killers love and they desire is attention, is infamy.
Yeah.
They want to have their little, 5 minutes of fame so people can talk about them for years and years to come. That's what they want. They want to put on defenses that vilify their victims, things like that. That's what these people do. So I'm actually not surprised. And honestly, sometimes I like it when people who are super cocky and super guilty go to trial, because I love nothing more than actually hearing just how guilty you are. I love particularly when the prosecution is well organized and done correctly, and they lay out that you are the guiltiest son of a gun to ever walk the earth. I love it because it continues to show your audacity. You really thought that you weren't going to get caught based on everything that the prosecution just laid out against you. That's crazy.
Crazy as hell. Also, if you're unfamiliar with this case, the investigation into these murders actually first kicked off when Shannon Gilbert disappeared in 2010. She basically ran from her client's home that was near Go Beach, and her disappearance launched a search that would eventually uncover the bodies of 4 women who had been dumped close to each other along Go Beach. In total, there have been at least 7 bodies discovered along Go Beach, including the body of an Asian male aged 17 to 23, and the body of a young woman and her young toddler. So Rex Heuermann hasn't been charged in those, but they have been connected to the Go Beach killer because of the location of their bodies.
Yeah, this case is crazy. I will say in general, I'm not particularly invested or interested in serial killers for the reasons I previously stated. I don't like the desire for infamy or anything like that, which is why you will rarely hear me and Cam talk about serial killers. And when we do, we make it a point to prioritize the victims and say their names and make sure people know who they are, because that's what's important, not this dude who is begging for attention.
Yeah. And sort of on the point you made earlier about Rex Heuermann's defense potentially using the trial as a way to vilify the victims, something I haven't mentioned yet, and something I'm only going to talk about briefly because it is not the focus of this case, and is also not what defines these victims' lives or worth, is the fact that all of these victims were engaged in sex work. And the only reason I feel it's important to call that out is to point out the danger that sex workers face, because a lot of men see them as targets because they don't view them as worth anything. And they also assume that their family is not going to look for them, that people aren't going to look for them, which is not true all the time. And I really hope that the prosecution shoots down any attempt to justify what Heuermann did to these women based on what they did to make money.
Absolutely. And honestly, Cam, I am going to disagree with you slightly in that I do think it's very important to talk about that these women engaged in sex work, because a lot of new age serial killers, I hate to use that term, but it kind of is what it is, are specifically targeting sex workers. It fits the pattern. It fits what they are doing because they have that mindset of like, oh, if you're a sex worker, I might be able to get away with it. So I think it is important to talk about that because it shows me consciousness of guilt, because you are targeting these women because you think they don't have family support. They don't have people who love them. They don't have people who will go out and look for them. That shows me that you're guilty because you know what you're doing. And so I do think it is important to mention that. But like you said, if the defense tries to make that a big part of this trial, it's not. All it does to me is show that your client is well aware that he thinks he can get away with these crimes if he targets women who are in sex work.
Right. I think it's important to the extent of intent. But what I wanted to clarify is that them being sex workers is not the most important part of their lives. These were women with full lives, with people who loved them, with people who missed them. And when people talk about them, I don't think the fact that they were sex workers needs to be the main focus.
On that point, I completely agree with you.
So on to our next case. We will be talking about when Miles Bryant was found guilty and sentenced for the murder of Susana Morales. Trigger warning here that I will be talking about the death of a child. So this event took place on June 12th, 2024 in Gwinnett County, Georgia. Miles Bryant, a former Doraville police officer, was convicted of the following charges: malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping, and false report of a crime, all in relation to the July 2022 disappearance and murder of 16-year-old Susana Morales. I will also note that there was a charge of attempted sexual assault, but Miles Bryant was not convicted of that charge. After his conviction, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as well as an additional 12 months for the charge of filing a false report. Now, a little bit more about this case. This was something that I learned about when her body was first found, and it really stuck out to me because she actually went missing on my birthday, July 26, 2022. But on July 26, 2022, Susana went missing on her way home from a friend's house, and at the trial, her friends and family would tell the court that they received Life 360 alerts that showed that she'd been involved in a possible car accident, and soon after this, they saw that she'd left the location of the accident at a high rate of speed. However, her remains wouldn't be found until February of 2023, and investigators would find Miles Bryant's gun, which he'd reported missing, in the woods near her remains. Investigators also connected Bryant to Susana through his job, where he was a courtesy officer at the apartment complex that Susana had visited that night. On top of this, they also had cell phone location evidence and internet search history that connected him to her disappearance and murder. Now, his defense tried to claim that the prosecution can't prove that Bryant caused her death, just that she was in his car and that he left her in the woods. They implied that she could have died from a drug overdose or something else. This was because, due to the state of her remains and the advanced state of decomposition, the coroner wasn't able to determine her cause of death. The trial itself was extremely emotional, with testimony and statements from Susana's mother, sister, and people who were investigating the case. Even the judge became emotional during the sentencing hearing. Her sister described how she'd lost 25 pounds, and her mother described the night that Susana disappeared and how she just kept trying to call her without an answer. The judge even called a 15-minute comfort break after one of the officers who aided in the search broke down multiple times on the stand. The prosecution also brought out Miles Bryant's ex-girlfriend to dispute his alibi that night, and they presented evidence from a previous case where he'd stalked one of his friends and attempted to break into her apartment. Him attempting to break into his friend's apartment was also caught on ring camera, so there's no way of disputing it. And the defense, despite their shoddy excuse for a justification, rested their case without presenting any witnesses.
You were right, friend. This case is going to make me mad because in a lot of ways, as soon as you said she was 16, the first thing that came to my mind was Umber. And how low of a human being do you have to be to imply that she might have overdosed on drugs based on what? Based on what? Do you have any evidence that she had ever used drugs in her entire life? Do you have any evidence that this friend was some kind of drug dealer or something? What? Based on what? You literally fabricated this defense out of thin air.
And even if she had used drugs before, how did she get in his car? How did she get in the woods? He's an officer. If she was experiencing a drug overdose, he should have been the first one who should have known the right thing to do.
Exactly. And also on top of that, Cam, how does his service weapon end up by her body?
The one he reported missing?
How does that happen? Crazy. This case infuriates me. It makes me mad. I am glad there is justice. I am glad he is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And Miles, I hope you burn in hell. I don't understand people who do fucked up things to children, people who hurt children for your own selfish desires. Because you cannot convince me, though he wasn't found guilty of it, you cannot convince me that he did not run down this child for the sole purpose of attacking and assaulting her.
Because she was found naked.
You can never convince me otherwise. And he's a disgusting human being. And at the end of the day, I know he's going to burn in hell. And what I also know is he's going to get it in prison, because inmates hate people who do things against kids. Inmates go out of their way to make people who do crimes against children's lives a living hell. And I love it, because I love a little street justice. I love a little street justice.
Exactly. You took this girl away from her family. You are an officer supposed to be a protector, because that's what officers are supposed to be. And you're out here causing harm. Why he hadn't lost his status as an officer after he stalked someone and was caught on camera, I don't know.
Let's talk about that, because sorry, Atlanta, y'all drag out a court case for 18 months that is completely unnecessary and completely built on a hill of bullshit. But we have video evidence of an officer committing a crime and nothing happens to him? Pardon?
That's all that we're going to talk about for the month of June. If there were any other things that happened in June that y'all want to call out, go ahead, leave it in the comments. Let us know. Maybe we'll make it into an episode.
Absolutely. And honestly, friend, we did not plan this, but you really set up the perfect segue into July, because we're going to go from one crooked cop to another set of what I believe to be crooked cops. So as we enter into the month of July, we're going to start by talking about the fact that on July 1st, 2024, a judge in Massachusetts declared a mistrial in the murder trial of Karen Reed. To give a quick overview of the case for those who are unfamiliar, in January of 2022, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, who was 46 years old at the time, died after an evening out in Canton, Massachusetts, with his girlfriend, Karen Reed, and several of their friends. At one of the bars the couple attended that night, they ran into another Boston police officer and some friends and were invited to a late night after party at the officer's house. Shortly after midnight, the couple drove to the house where Officer John O'Keefe got out of Miss Reed's black Lexus SUV, and for reasons I do not know, Karen decided that she was not going to the after party and returned to the home of John O'Keefe. The following morning, Karen wakes up and discovers that John is still not home and immediately goes into a frenzy to look for him. After calling a couple of her friends to come and get her, they returned to the home where Karen dropped John off, and John would be found in that front yard, unresponsive. After calling paramedics, it was discovered that Officer John O'Keefe had severe head injuries and hypothermia. He would later be pronounced dead on January 29, 2022, at a local hospital. Karen Reed was arrested 3 days later and charged with second-degree murder, motor vehicle manslaughter, and other related charges. She pled not guilty, and her defense team would later allege that she was framed for the crime, alleging a cover-up involving local law enforcement officers that were present at the scene. However, prosecutors alleged that the couple had been fighting and that Karen had accelerated in reverse, intentionally hitting John O'Keefe and leaving him in the snow. They cited vehicular damage, forensic evidence that tied John O'Keefe to the SUV, and statements from witnesses, including emergency responders, who recalled Karen saying, quote, "I hit him," end quote, in the morning he was found. However, Karen suggested that she uttered the phrase in a panicked question rather than an admission of guilt. Quote, "I hit him," versus, quote, "I hit him," end quote. The defense argued that Officer John O'Keefe was beaten at the party, and members of that party framed Karen Reed, pointing to alleged police bias and mishandling of evidence, including but not limited to the collection of the victim's blood from the crime scene in red Solo cups and utilizing a leaf blower to find said evidence, as well as the lead investigator, Trooper Michael Proctor, sending vulgar, misogynistic, and derogatory text messages to his colleagues about the Karen Reed case. In these text messages, he joked about searching her phone for nude photos and mocked her health problems. Karen Reed suffers from multiple sclerosis, critiqued her appearance, and said he hoped she killed herself. He also stated that she was guilty just hours into the investigation and that the homeowner of the house where Officer John O'Keefe died wasn't going to have any issues with police because, quote, homeowners a Boston cop too, end quote, which sounds like corruption to me, but that's just my opinion. The defense also had highlighted a web of relationships that connected some of the people who were in the house that night to the local law enforcement officers who investigated the case in order to bolster their argument that they were involved in a cover-up, as these officers should have been removed from the investigation due to an appearance of a conflict of interest. AKA, if you know the owner of the home, you probably cannot investigate this case. And the biggest piece of information, in my opinion, that came out during the trial is the defense offered witnesses who were associated with an FBI investigation in relation to the handling of this case, who testified that Officer John O'Keefe's injuries were not consistent with that of a car accident. The trial lasted almost 10 weeks and revealed deep division amongst the community. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury remained hopelessly deadlocked, leading to a mistrial on July 1st, 2024. Karen's defense lawyers continued to criticize the integrity of the investigation, particularly the derogatory and unprofessional text messages from lead investigator Trooper Michael Proctor, who was later suspended without pay in relation to this case, while prosecutors maintained that there was no conspiracy and vowed to retry the case, with the new trial scheduled for January 2025. However, the trial has been rescheduled to take place in April of 2025. Meanwhile, John O'Keefe's surviving family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Karen Reed and the 2 bars the couple drank at, accusing them of contributing to Officer John O'Keefe's death through negligence.
I will say, I actually am not as familiar with the details of this case. It has been one that's been on my list to do a deep dive on, just because I know it's so messy. I'm like, I can't just dip my toes in. I gotta dive in head first.
Oh, absolutely, friend. And luckily for you, I watched every single day of this 10-week trial with Emily D. Baker. And I watched every examination, every cross-examination, heard Trooper Proctor read every nasty, vulgar text he sent about this woman just hours after her arrest. And I gotta be honest with you, I don't know if Karen did it. I genuinely have no idea. But what I do know is that none of the evidence that was collected by that police department is reliable. One of the things that was super crazy to me, and maybe nobody else cared about this, but I sure did, is that the home where John O'Keefe was found was at the Albert family's home. A member of the Albert family was in Trooper Proctor's sister's wedding. Now, I don't know if that's enough degrees of separation to put him away from this case, but personally, he has this strong belief, he said it in a million nasty ways, that he has this strong belief that Karen did it. And if you really think she did it, in order to protect justice, do you not find it wise to just remove yourself from the case, as it is 2 degrees of separation, but that still feels a little too close?
Right.
Especially when the defense kind of puts the argument that the person who was a ring bearer in the sister's wedding is who the defense actually alleges beat up John O'Keefe.
Now that's messy. And I would agree with that. I feel like officers who are invested in justice would pull themselves out of a case like this, even if they think they can be impartial. They're thinking about the trial and they're thinking about getting that conviction. And they know it's a lot harder to get that conviction if the defense can bring up any sort of bias, any sort of thing like that. Because what you don't want to happen is a mistrial.
Absolutely. And not only that, but also what you don't want is the feds to force you to hand over your cell phone so that all these text messages come out. Because that's how we got all these text messages, is because the feds are looking into this case. And again, if the FBI is a knocking, you're already You just are. I'm so sorry. I hate to have to break it to you this way, but you are. So maybe, girl, we can do a deep dive on this case on Patreon. I can give you a full breakdown of who all our players are, and you can get an understanding of just how entangled and messy this case is. From, again, the mishandling of evidence. Why the hell did you collect blood in red Solo cups that aren't sterile, that aren't approved by any medical professional or crime scene tech? Why would you ever do that? Why are you using a leaf blower to blow around evidence? And there's video of them doing this. It's just so poorly handled. And the thing that pisses me off about all of it is it's so poorly handled that even if Karen did it, I don't feel good convicting her off of your evidence. And thus, Officer John O'Keefe gets no justice because you failed to do your job. And now his family, his poor nieces and nephews, I didn't even tell you this part. I don't know if you know, his niece and nephew lost their mother and father within a month of each other and now have lost their uncle. And they're like 13, I think. They're teens. I don't even think the younger child is a teenager yet. And they've been through so much. And because you bullshit your job, there's no justice for these children. There's no justice for his family. And that is what pisses me off.
Yeah. And one thing about the Boston police, I used to live in Boston for 3 years. And one of my favorite shows to watch while I was in Boston is called City on a Hill, which basically details Boston in the 90s. Boston was super corrupt in the 80s, like mob, mafia level corruption. And they basically had this big cleanup. There was an officer who killed his wife and blamed it on a black guy, basically. Yeah, that was like one of the culminating events of all the corruption. But even though that show was a drama, it is really good because it references a lot of the corruption that was happening in Boston and what it was like in sort of that post-cleanup era.
That's super interesting. I will be adding that to my list of shows to watch. So now we're going to get into our second case for July. A man who was suspected of murdering a mother and her 2 daughters in a crossbow attack was arrested on July 11th, 2024. Carol Hunt, who was 61, and her daughters, Hannah, 28, and Louise, 25, were killed in their home in Bushey, Hertfordshire, on the evening of Tuesday, July 9th. Kyle Clifford, a 26-year-old man from Enfield, North London, was arrested on July 11th and charged with 3 counts of murder. Kyle was found wounded in a cemetery in Enfield on July 10th and was rushed to the hospital in severe condition, police say. The victims were the wife and 2 of the 3 daughters of BBC commentator John Hunt. From the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Hertfordshire Major Crime Unit expressed condolences, stating, quote, "Our thoughts will remain with the victim's family at this tragic time." He confirmed that the investigation is progressing rapidly and that a man had been arrested. Police also revealed that a crossbow was recovered as part of the investigation, and the murders sparked an outpouring of grief and tribute from friends, family, and the wider community. A vigil was held on July 11th at St. James Church in Bushey and attended by more than 50 people. Following this vigil, Kyle Clifford was charged with murder, false imprisonment, and 2 counts of possession of offensive weapons.
Yeah, I remember seeing this case on the news and it was so sad because it's like you took out this whole family and he was the ex-boyfriend of one of the daughters. So maybe there was some jealousy, revenge, or something like that. But you took out this entire family for what? You took away a man's wife and daughters. You took away people's friends, people's loved ones. For what? Just senseless.
Absolutely senseless. And you killed them so brutally.
Like animals, really.
Right. You hunted them down like they were your prey. That's such a scary element of this case. And my heart just breaks for John because he lost a wife and 2 of his 3 girls. And he has to somehow pull his life together and continue to grow and move on and develop without them after they were killed so senselessly and so evilly. And now we're going to close out July with our final case, which took place on July 16th, 2024. Bob Menendez, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, was found guilty on all charges in a federal corruption trial marking a dramatic fall for the long-serving politician. Bob Menendez was charged with 16 counts, including bribery, extortion, acting as a foreign agent, obstruction of justice, and several counts of conspiracy. He had pled not guilty to all charges. The trial revolved around accusations that Bob and his wife, Nadine, accepted bribes, including gold bars, cash, and a luxury car, from businessmen seeking to influence the senator's actions to benefit Qatar and Egypt. Prosecutors presented evidence that FBI agents found over $480,000 in cash, some in envelopes, hidden in closets and jackets at Bob Menendez's home during a 2022 search. And this is important to note because these envelopes also had the fingerprints of Bob's co-defendants on them. Bob's defense team tried to argue that the money was unrelated to bribes and tied to the family's distrust of banks, a practice that was defended by his sister, who said in court, quote, "It was normal. It's a Cuban thing," end quote. However, prosecutors countered that the bribes were unmistakable, pointing to direct benefits Bob provided to the businessman. Damian Williams, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, celebrated the conviction, asserting it marked the end of Bob's, quote, "years of selling his office to the highest bidder," end quote. Bob Menendez maintained his innocence, expressing disappointment with the verdict and vowing to appeal the conviction. Nadine Menendez's trial was postponed due to her breast cancer diagnosis, while the two businessmen implicated in the crime, Wael Hanna and Fred Debs, were also convicted. While a third businessman, Jose Uribe, pleaded guilty and testified during the trial. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and Bob Menendez was emotionless as the verdict was read, but shook his head in disagreement. His family, however, was visibly distraught. Bob Menendez was set to be sentenced on October 29th, 2024, but his sentence was postponed to January 2025 by the judge overseeing the case. At the time, 31 Democratic senators had already called for him to resign before the conviction, but with no legal mandate preventing Bob Menendez from serving despite his conviction, Bob's political future hinges on a Senate Ethics Committee investigation which might recommend expulsion. Expulsion requires a 2/3 Senate vote and is a rare occurrence in U.S. history.
Yeah, two things. One, unfortunately, we have seen that a conviction is not enough to keep people away from our highest political offices. And second thing, on his sister saying, "Oh, it's a Cuban thing, that's just what we do." That's cool if you're a regular person. If you're a senator, you gotta keep track of the money that's coming in and out your house. Like, that's just basics.
Come on now, because it'd be different if he had 10, 15, 20, I'm gonna say all the way up to $50,000 in the house. Genuinely, I think that's normal. But almost $500,000 in cash.
And you can't track where it came from, or you can't say where it came from.
Sorry, sweetie, we've teetered over into suspicious territory. Because also, and maybe this is because I'm broke, I'm willing to accept that. Maybe this is me speaking broke right now, but I don't even want that much cash in my house. I would be terrified if I had that much cash in my house.
Same. Also, this is getting into finances, but it just doesn't make sense to have that much cash because the cash is depreciating in value as time goes on. But that's just us. Maybe we speak broke.
I completely agree with you because you're not even collecting interest on it. You know how much interest $500,000 will collect in the bank?
Mm-hmm.
And look, I do understand that historically, banks are not very trustworthy entities. But unfortunately, we keep choosing to loan our money to them. So it is what it is.
And we're not going to cover this just for time, but it is very similar to the case that Eric Adams is facing, where he was using his connections in Turkey and being bribed by Turkish officials to do favors for them in exchange for gifts and money.
Absolutely. But I will say the one thing that I think Eric really messed up on is he didn't get the plugs while he was out there. Everybody knows that if you go to Turkey, you get the hair transplant. That's why you go. And he never got it. And that's where I really think he messed up. Because if he had come back with a fresh hairline, I actually don't think anybody would have questioned anything.
True. I was just going to Turkey for a re-up.
Come on now. I got to keep that thing crispy, It's got to heal correctly. And that wraps up all of the crazy cases that we found the most interesting for July. If you have other cases that you think were even crazier and that we didn't cover, please be sure to leave them in the comments below.
Please do. Now on to August. Whew, y'all. Was there something in the Kool-Aid and the water? Because again, y'all were on one. Not two, not three, but one. So we're going to kick August off with 5 people being charged due to their involvement in Matthew Perry's death. Trigger warning here for discussion of substance use and addiction. So this took place on August 15th, 2024 in Los Angeles County, California. 5 people, including 2 doctors and Matthew Perry's personal assistant, were charged in Matthew's death, which took place in October 2023 and was the result of a drug overdose, specifically ketamine. According to the autopsy, the amount of ketamine in his system was akin to anesthesia levels. Police and prosecutors alleged that a quote-unquote broad underground criminal network of drugs and the exploitation of his substance use issues led to his death. Specifically, they found that his personal assistant, Kenneth Iwamasa, had provided him with over $50,000 worth of ketamine just a few weeks before his death. His doctor, Dr. Salvador Plasencia, was one of the alleged sources of ketamine, and prosecutors claimed that he even instructed Matthew Perry's assistant on how to inject him with ketamine, which is against the law, HIPAA, moral, ethics, common sense, all that. Another alleged source of the ketamine was a woman named Jasveen Singha, who was nicknamed, quote unquote, the ketamine queen. Dr. Mark Chavez, Eric Fleming, and Kenneth Iwamasa have all pleaded guilty to drug charges. Dr. Plasencia and Jasveen Singha have pleaded not guilty. Now, for those who don't know, ketamine is used to treat anxiety, depression, and pain, and Matthew Perry was going through ketamine infusion therapy. However, the ketamine he was receiving from his assistant and these doctors were on top of that. There's also a lot of evidence against these people, but one of the most heinous pieces of evidence is Dr. Salvador Plasencia sending a text message saying, quote, "I wonder how much this moron is going to pay," end quote. There was even an incident earlier that month in October where one of the doses caused Matthew to basically freeze up. And despite this, his assistant still continued to give him doses. Now, Matthew Perry's struggle with his substance use issues was no secret. He'd been open about this, and his addiction to alcohol and painkillers dated back to the 90s when he was filming Friends. And to get into the specific charges for this case, Jasveen Singha, the ketamine queen, has been charged with distribution of ketamine. Dr. Plasencia has been charged with distribution of ketamine and altering and falsifying documents. Eric Fleming has been charged with conspiracy to distribute ketamine and distribution of ketamine. Dr. Mark Chavez has been charged with conspiracy to distribute ketamine, and Kenneth Iwamasa, the personal assistant, has been charged with conspiracy to distribute ketamine causing death.
Yeah, friend. Honestly, I was never much of a Friends fan by any means, but I was well aware of who Matthew Perry was, again, just because I appreciated his openness and honesty when it came to his struggles with addiction. And I just respect people who acknowledge that they have a problem and in a lot of ways try to work on that. And I remember when I first found out that he had passed away, and my immediate reaction was, this is suspicious. I didn't even know anything about the ketamine. I didn't know anything about those specific struggles, but everything in me was like, I mean, he was 54 at the time of his passing, and 54-year-olds don't just drop dead for no reason. And the fact that there wasn't an immediate release of like the cause of death and the circumstances surrounding the death, again, leaned into me going immediately, everything about this is suspicious. So I was waiting for those charges to drop. It surprised me that they took as long as they did. Also, to plead not guilty when you have text messages calling the victim an idiot, how low of a human being are you? Not just for administering this, but then to ridicule a man's addiction?
Right. And we're going to get into Miss Singha too, because apparently She was jet setting, staying in luxury hotels, all of this, spending all this money. And when police raided her home in LA, they basically found the lab that she was using to create these vials of ketamine. They found cocaine, all of this stuff. Now, there are people who use these drugs recreationally, who use them in ways that don't cause death. However, there are people with substance use issues who don't know when to stop. And I think especially for the doctor, when you knew that there was an instance earlier that month when he used too much, when you taught his assistant how to basically inject him with this, which should go against everything you were taught in medical school, there's no way you can say you're not responsible.
Exactly. It's literally impossible. It's audacious, honestly.
Right. And I do think there is an interesting conversation about the personal assistant, because some people will say, in LA, if you're a personal assistant to a celebrity, you basically have to do what they say. I do think, having never been in that position, I can't say for sure what I would have done. However, from the outside in, it is really hard to understand how you continue to do that, seeing that it could literally cause the death or paralysis of the person you're working for. Like, some of that self-preservation needs to kick in at that point.
I think you're absolutely right. It's very easy to be on the outside and say, oh, well, I just would have left. I wouldn't have done that. Blah, 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 blah. Right? You also don't know what financial situation that person is in, what personal situation that person is in, that would lead them to make decisions to continue to do something. Because personally, I do draw the line at illegal activity. But if I was on the verge of homelessness, because it's crazily expensive to live in LA, if I was on the verge of homelessness without this job, I could understand how somebody could push their morals to the side in order to maintain employment. But honestly, if I saw a man and genuinely thought he might die in that moment, that would be too much for me.
Yeah. Even if you don't particularly care for that person, like I said, self-preservation. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to go to prison.
Right. I'm not built for jail. I am not built for jail. I'm a queen size bed, 4 bamboo pillows kind of girl. I'm not built for jail.
Literally. I'm a chai latte type of girl. Not built for it.
Come on now.
So, on to our next case, which is the sentencing of Crystal Kaiser to 11 years in prison. Trigger warning here for sexual assault and sex trafficking of a minor. So, this took place on August 20th, 2024 in Kenosha County, Wisconsin. Crystal Kaiser was sentenced to 11 years in prison plus 5 years of extended supervision after pleading guilty to reckless homicide. For those who don't know, this was all related to the 2018 death of Randall Volar, who she said was sexually trafficking her. Her guilty plea, which she submitted in May, made it so that she could avoid trial and a longer sentence. Now, prosecutors in the trial stated that Crystal shot Randall in 2018, burned his house down, and stole his car. Crystal, who was 17 at the time, said that she'd met Randall on a website used for sex trafficking and that over the years she'd known him, he'd assaulted her and forced her to perform sex work, and that she'd shot him after he tried to touch her. This trial was especially popular due to the increased advocacy and attention from anti-violence groups. The defense argued that Crystal could not be charged due to a 2008 state law that absolved victims of sex trafficking of any crime they committed connected to said trafficking, while the prosecution said that the writers of this law did not intend for that to cover murder. And if you do want more information on this case, I will say the podcast Sisters Who Kill did a really good episode on the Crystal Kaiser case.
That might be a little problematic in this statement, but if it wasn't your intention to cover murder, maybe you should have wrote a better law that says that in black and white.
That's what I'm saying.
Because it's sounding like she was well within her rights. It makes me sad that we even have to debate the legality of this, because also she's a child. I hate that this was even something that was like debated through court. She's a child. She can't consent to anything.
Right.
And I just hate cases like this because luckily she got a reduced sentence and, she'll be out of prison, presumably by her mid-30s, which is great. And she'll still get to go on and live a amazing full life, hopefully. But she has a lot of trauma to work through that I hope somehow she gets the help for in prison.
Yeah. It's sad to think that she is, 3 years younger than us, 3 or 4 years younger than us, and had to go through that as a teenager and is now having to go through the system. And it's even sadder to know that there are teenagers actively going through this right now.
Absolutely. I think this is the one thing I hate about true crime in a lot of ways is the more I learn, the more I research, the more I realize that no case is special, that there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who have had the same traumatic experience. The human mind's capacity, not only for creativity, as we've said on this podcast before, but for evil is unmatched.
And I do hope that Crystal can make the most of her next 11 years, take advantage of the few opportunities that are there in these prisons so that when she does get out, she's not starting from nothing, because I think that's also a really tough thing about prison and why the recidivism rates are so high is that when people get out, it's so uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with themselves because they have not been in society. And US prisons do not prepare people to reintegrate into society. And so I do hope that Crystal can, as much as is possible, make it so that her integration into society is not as jarring and she is able to start a new life once she gets out.
Absolutely. Because again, she'll be out in her 30s. She still has an amazing full life that can be lived, and I hope she does.
Okay, now on to our last case for August and our last case for this episode. To close out, we will be talking about Bryan Kohberger's lawyers requesting a change of venue. This took place on August 29th, 2024 in Latah County, Idaho. Now, on this day, Latah County District Judge John Judge heard arguments from Kohberger's lawyers that Bryan Kohberger's trial should be moved from Latah County, where the infamous murders took place, to Ada County, about 300 miles south. His lawyers argued that potential jurors would be biased due to the case's infamy and intense media coverage. The prosecution countered with the fact that the gag order that's been in place since the early days of the trial has prevented a media frenzy. Bryan Kohberger has been charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of burglary in relation to the murders of 4 students at the University of Idaho: Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Their murders, which took place on November 13th, 2022, at an off-campus apartment shared by Madison, Kaylee, and Xana, shook the tiny community of Moscow, Idaho. Over a month later, and after an intense search effort that included Moscow Police, Pennsylvania State Police, and the FBI, Moscow Police announced that they'd arrested Bryan Kohberger, who was getting his PhD at Washington State University nearby. In May 2023, his lawyers entered a not guilty plea. And after this hearing in August, on September 6th, the judge granted the defense's request that the trial be moved out of Latah County. And on September 12th, the Idaho Supreme Court decided that the trial would be held in Ada County, where Boise, the state capital, is. The trial is currently set to begin on August 8th, 2025. I will say regarding this argument about the trial being moved, Kohberger's lawyers presented psychological experts that agreed with the recommendation to move the trial, citing evidence from research and other experts that showed the impact of intense media coverage on jury bias. Steve Gonsalves, father of Kaylee, was not convinced by the defense's argument and said that he believed jurors could be impartial and unbiased, while Christy, her mother, said that the Moscow community should be part of the trial. I'll also say that in 2010, the Supreme Court heard a case regarding juror bias when the chief executive of Enron tried to argue that their case should be moved out of Houston. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg issued a ruling that said, quote, "Prominence does not necessarily produce prejudice, and juror impartiality does not require ignorance," end quote. I think that is an amazing take on this, but this is not going to be the first time that a trial has been moved due to intense media coverage. Other examples of this are the trial of Scott Peterson, the trial of the Los Angeles officers who killed Rodney King, and the trial of the DC snipers. Now, when it comes to the evidence that the prosecution has against Kohberger, we have DNA from a knife sheath found at the crime scene, tracking data on his car and cell phone, and other evidence like gloves and stained pillowcases that had been found at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. This is another one of those cases where we're not going to do a deep dive right now. One, the case has not been concluded. And like we said at the start, we really like to discuss cases once the trial has concluded. And two, this is meant to be a little taster episode. And we just don't have the time to go into all of the details that have come out about this case. But we do recognize that this has been one of the main cases in the news because the killings of these 4 students was just so tragic and scary because it's one of those cases that reminds you that this kind of thing can happen to anyone.
Absolutely. I have been softly focusing on this case, but part of the reason why I never really dived super deep into it is because, in all honesty, it's really hard for me to invest in cases and get into cases where I feel a little too close to home. These are 3 young women and a young man who were close to my age, who were in college, who were putting themselves in a position to do so great in life, and they were senselessly taken off of this earth. Cases like that feel a little too close to home are just hard for me to invest in, but obviously I want to be aware of it because I'm a firm believer in you do a disservice to victims when you ignore their stories. And absolutely, when this trial is finished, when all the evidence has come out, I would love to do a deep dive on this case with you. Definitely something that we will put on Patreon because this case is just so well known and everybody in the US of A is talking about it. But I think that's the great thing about doing our end of year recap is taking a moment to talk about cases that are active, that are important to people, that maybe touch a little too close to home, and allow us to empower victims and talk about them and respect their stories in our own way. But yeah, this case is crazy. This case is upsetting. I actually got to meet somebody who went to Washington State and was on campus when Kohberger was arrested. And she talked about how for months the community was in shambles. They were scared. They were terrified of everything. There were mass bulletins put out for students to lock all their doors and make sure they were being as safe as possible. And that's a terrifying state to be in when you know there is an active threat looming over you. And I just wish so much peace to that community. I hope the community gets the justice and healing that it needs. I hope the families of the victims get the justice and the healing that they need.
Yeah, and I especially wish peace as much as it's possible for the 2 roommates who were in the house when this happened, but were not killed because I know that they carry a lot of guilt with them. And that is especially hard.
Absolutely. As we wrap up today's discussion, we're going to move into our segment called Today in Crime, where we'll discuss a crime or crime-related event that took place on this day. So, on December 20th, 1986, 3 Black men are attacked by a group of white teenagers yelling racial slurs in Howard Beach, a predominantly white, middle-class Italian-American neighborhood in Queens, New York. Earlier that night, the men were driving from Brooklyn, Queens, when their car broke down near Howard Beach. They walked several miles to a pizza parlor in Howard Beach, where they asked to use a phone to call for assistance. After being told there was no phone available, they ordered some pizza. When the men left the pizzeria, they were confronted by a gang of teens. One of the men, Michael Griffith, 23, was chased into traffic on the Belt Parkway and died after being hit by a car. A second man, Cedric Sandiford, was severely beaten, while the third man, Timothy Grimes, outran the assailants and escaped without serious injury. The attack stroked racial tensions in New York City and garnered national headlines. The 2 surviving victims, distrustful of police in Queens, who they believed were treating them like perpetrators, refused to cooperate further with investigators and the district attorney's office. Civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton led a large group of demonstrators on a protest march through Howard Beach and was met by a smaller band of counter demonstrators who shouted abuse. Reverend Al Sharpton and other Black leaders believed the Queens District Attorney's Office was mishandling the case and called for the appointment of a special state prosecutor. New York Governor Mario Cuomo named Charles Hines in this position. Reverend Al Sharpton was later accused of using the case to further his own political agenda and increase his national profile. In December 1987, after 12 days of jury deliberation, 3 teens, John Lesser, 17, Jason Ladon, 17, and Scott Kern, 19, were convicted of manslaughter for the death of Michael Griffith. And that is what happened in crime today. If you found this story interesting, leave a raised fist emoji in the comments.
That is 1986. Not that long ago.
Right.
3 years before Taylor Swift was born.
Come on now.
2 years after Beyonce was born.
Yep. And a man lost his life because he dared to walk into an establishment and ask for help and ordered a pizza, and he lost his life. Senseless violence like this, especially racially motivated senseless violence like this, pisses me off to my core. Because again, don't be sitting here talking to me about how, oh, that was so long ago and racism was so long ago. And we just established that people who are young were born when this case took place. When this case happened less than 40 years ago. Do not ever have the audacity to have a conversation of everybody needs to get over racism.
Right. Michael Griffith would have been in his 60s today.
Exactly. Could have been a thriving middle-aged man. And instead he lost his life for nothing. And I'd be very curious, because we didn't get into it and the article didn't have it listed. I'd be very curious to what the actual sentence was, because they got manslaughter, which is the epitome of a slap on the wrist, especially as 2 of them were minors. And I'm sure they got treated as such.
Right. And also the counter protesters. What are you counter protesting?
I want to be racist. Why won't y'all just let me be racist and hateful?
Right.
That's what they're protesting. I have a right to be a racist, hateful. I have a right to do that.
Any other thoughts, friend?
Nope. That's all I've got.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. We covered a lot of cases today, and there are way too many sources to name and thank, but we would like to give a special thank you to our listeners who supported us and listened to us all throughout this year and last. If you'd like to check out photos related to these cases, follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, please be sure to tell a friend and leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish Podcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our channel and leave any comments or questions in the comment section. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.